Right, so with a film analysis, guys, we don't need to necessarily watch an entire film or even a scene. We can actually take just a screenshot, a still from it. So watch this through and we'll start once it's done.
Did you see that?
Alrighty guys, now time for the film analysis side of things. So when we're actually looking at a film, when we're analysing it, we're looking at the mise-en-scene, which is what it's actually made of, how it all comes together, the technical aspects of it. And they're broken up into 12 different areas, well, 11 and a half really, but for our posters we put 12 together. Now don't forget that these posters, guys, you can get from Moodle. I've put them up on Google Classroom. They're also up as posters in our classroom, so there's no excuses for not knowing these. Alright guys, so the first element that I want us to have a look at is the dominant feature. Alright, that's kind of made up of three things. Three things that can kind of show you what the dominant feature is. So the size of the object, the color of the object, and how much of it's in focus, the camera's focus. Alright, so in this example, the dominant feature is Arthur, who's the character at the back. Now, I know that it's counterintuitive to think, oh, the character at the back who's smaller, what about the character at the front? But have a look at the color. Have a look at the colour of the actor at the front. His costume tends to blend in with what's around it. Also, our character at the back, Arthur, is actually looking at us. Okay, so that helps to draw us in. He's also in a little bit more focus. Okay, so whilst those three elements are important, you can see that as you look at it, what is the thing that kind of grabs your eye first? All right, that's what the dominant feature is. All right, the next element, guys, that I want us to have a look at is the lighting key. All right, so that can be made up of high key, a low key, and a high contrast. All right, so they're kind of the three options that we have. So a high key, there's lots of light filling out the space, the set. There's not many shadows, there's not many places to hide. Opposite to that is low key, and that's where you've got lots of shadows, lots of places to hide. There's not much visual information on the screen. And then there's high contrast, which is kind of a merger of the two. So there's lots of light happening, but there's also lots of shadows at the same time. Okay, so in this example here, I'd say it's probably more high key. You can't see very many shadows. There's lots of light on the set. There's not any places where people could hide. There's not any information that we're missing. All right, the next element, guys, is shot angle. Okay, so what we're looking at here is 5 different angles. So we've got the bird's eye view, which is kind of that top-down film from a helicopter or a drone, something along those lines. We've got the high angle, where the camera's kind of maybe on a ladder or you're standing on a chair or something like that to kind of get that angle looking down. We've got the eye level shot, which is kind of where it lines up with the eyes. The low angle, where obviously the camera's then lower than the head. Okay, and then the oblique angle. All right. Now, I'd suggest that this is kind of a combination. All right, it's an oblique angle shot because obviously everything in the room is turned kind of 45 degrees. but also it's an eye level shot for our main character at the back there. So you can start to have combinations of all of these things starting to come together. So the next element, guys, is color values. All right, so we can have our dominant color, our subsidiary color, and within that you can kind of play around with color symbolism. So the dominant color is kind of, I guess, self-explanatory, the color that is most seen on the screen. All right, so in this case, we're kind of looking at some beiges. There's a tanny kind of color in there. So along those lines. Then you've got the subsidiary colors. So it's kind of then what else is happening around that. So interestingly, in this scene, the dominant color is all around, but they actually use the subsidiary color to kind of help create or make our main character the dominant feature that we talked about before. You can also look at color symbolism. So, the idea of blues being very trusting, greens being very earthy, red, fire, passion, are working along those lines. Directors will actually dress their characters in specific colors because, or using that color symbolism to help you connect with the character in the way that they want. The next element I want to talk about, guys, is the subsidiary features. Okay, so it links really, really closely with the dominant feature, but in this case, it's what else is happening on the screen. What other characters are there? What else is going on? So in this case, our subsidiary feature is our bad guy at the front there. Very, very easy to work it out with this scene. Some other scenes might be a little bit more complicated and you might have multiple subsidiaries, but you'll always have a dominant feature of the scene, and then the subsidiary is anything that's happening around that. The next element we're going to have a chat about, guys, is screen density. So how much is actually packed onto the screen there? Whilst this one might look like there's plenty going on with the lights, the pictures, the paneling, it's not actually that dense. I guess if you look at it as though you were walking down a normal hallway, that's what you would expect to see. So the idea with screen density is how much has the director crammed in there? How much is actually pushed onto the screen there? How much extra space is there around? And I guess in this case, guys, it's not very dense. The next element we're going to have a look at, guys, is composition. So we've got three options. We can have a horizontal, a vertical, or a diagonal. So a horizontal composition is going to have obviously a lot of horizontal lines. Now, that's not that the director's got a texture out and drawn all over it. It's that all of the lines that you kind of see are working horizontally across the screen. Obviously, then opposite to that is vertical. So vertical meaning we might have a lot of actors on the screen because people tend to stand. That makes them vertical. So you might have a very vertical composition just from having your actors standing on the stage. The final one, and the one that we actually see here, is the diagonal or oblique composition. So you can see lots of angular lines. It's there to help kind of disorientate us when it comes to this scene. Obviously, when they're spinning around, you want to make people feel that. That's why there's so many lines in there, and hence why it's a diagonal composition. The next element we want to have a look at, guys, is depth of field. Now, interestingly, most Hollywood films tend to use a really shallow focus. Okay, so that's where the actors are kind of in focus, but everything behind them's very blurry. Everything in front of them's a little bit blurry, okay? And that helps us to focus on what action the director wants us to actually have a look at. But interestingly, in this case, or this example, guys, we've got quite a deep focus because we can see everything's relatively in focus close to the camera and all the way back. And that's because we've got our main actor right at the back there. Therefore, we want to put them in focus, but we also want to have the foreground in focus, meaning that we need quite a deep depth of field, a deep focus there. The next element, guys, is character placement. So we can have our characters placed towards the top of the screen, towards the bottom of the screen, or out towards the sides. Now, interestingly, in this one, if you drew a horizontal line straight across the middle of our shot there, our key character, our dominant feature, Arthur, is maybe just a little bit above that halfway line. So you wouldn't say that he's right towards the top, but he's pretty close towards the top. But interestingly, our subsidiary feature, our bad guy in this case, is actually towards the bottom. And when you put people towards the bottom, you can kind of evoke in the audience's mind this idea of vulnerability, or that they're powerless. And if you actually look at our scene from an audience perspective, you'll see that Arthur is balanced. He's ready to go on with whatever it is that he needs to do. and our bad guy is all off balance, he doesn't know what he's doing. By placing him towards the bottom of the screen, that really helps to reinforce that. The next element, guys, is a really, really important one, shot framing. So we can have two types. You have tight framing, where the camera's brought right up to the actor's face and body. There's not much information around the outside of them. And that's really, really good for horror films or suspense films, because you're not giving the audience the information about what is actually happening around. But in this case, we've got a loose shot, okay? So the camera's a long way back, and you can see a lot of what's actually happening around them. And this makes sense because they're running around, they're jumping, they're flipping off of this building that's rotating around them. You don't want to have it too close, because it would be very, very difficult to keep the camera tracking the actor's face. Normally, if you had the camera that close, you'd be needing to move it significantly, and that would make it very, very difficult to keep it going. So loose shots tend to help when there's lots of action happening around. The final two elements, guys, are more like 1.5 elements, okay? So we have diegetic audio and non-diegetic audio. Now, diegetic audio is what actually is, or the sound, the audio that you hear that is happening on the screen, and it actually makes sense. So right towards the end of our scene where Arthur shoots the bad guy, that gun going off, that's a diegetic sound, okay? It's happening within the film, it makes sense. All right. The tricky one to think about is non-diegetic audio. All right. So that's sound that's happening outside of the film that doesn't actually make sense. So you can have soundtracks. So in our example, you could hear music playing along in the background. You couldn't see a string orchestra playing it. There were no CD players set up that could be where the audio is coming from. So you could make a really strong case that that's non-diegetic audio. All right. The really key thing to keep in mind, though, guys, is just because you can't see where it's playing on the screen doesn't make it non-diegetic, okay? If, for example, it's a really windy day and you can hear trees rustling, just because you can't see the trees rustling doesn't mean that it's non-diegetic. Because it works within the soundscape of what's happening in the scene, that makes it diegetic. That was the 12 elements of mise-en-scene and film analysis. Use these guys through your investigations. Use them when you're thinking about the creation of your films, okay? Try and think about each element as you're putting together your films. Remember that we are entering these films into film contests. We want to make them as good as we possibly can. So take this theory, take this knowledge, apply it to what it is that you're doing, and hopefully you can win a few film competitions based off of this.